What would you do if your HOA decided to pull a full-blown police-style raid over something as simple as closing your own driveway? Sounds crazy, right? Well, in this story, an overzealous HOA enforcer, a pretend security squad, and even a K-9 unit all ended up learning the hard way that playing the role of law enforcement doesn't always go as planned. And the best part? None of them had the slightest clue that the person they were messing with was actually the son of the chief of police. Buckle up because this one is a wild ride. I moved into this suburban neighborhood around 5 years ago, drawn by the idea of a peaceful life away from the constant noise of the city. My house is located about halfway down a gently curving street lined with nearly identical single-family homes. If you've ever seen those old sitcoms with neatly maintained yards and uniform sidewalks, you can picture exactly what my neighborhood looks like. Some houses have kept their traditional white picket fences, while others have updated to sleek metal ones. Perfectly trimmed hedges frame each property, and at least one or two shiny SUVs sit parked in every driveway. On the surface, it seems like the kind of place where people mind their own business and keep things civil, or at least that's what I thought. My home blends in with the rest, but I've added a few small personal touches over the years to make it my own. The shutters are painted a slightly darker shade. Hanging plants sway near the front porch, and a well-kept flower bed greets visitors as they approach the door. Before the whole gate situation, these details had never been an issue. In fact, they had either gone completely unnoticed or received the occasional polite compliment from a neighbor. No big deal. I always made sure that any updates I made aligned with the existing HOA rules, especially after hearing horror stories about nightmare HOAs in other areas. For the first 3 years, everything was relatively calm. If someone's lawn got a little too overgrown, they might receive a friendly reminder. If the paint on a house started to chip, they would get a polite suggestion to touch it up before the next season. Nothing felt too strict or overbearing. Sure, the HOA board members weren't exactly the warmest bunch, but they mostly kept their distance. That all changed about a year and a half ago when Maria took over as HOA president. And let me tell you, the entire vibe of the neighborhood shifted overnight. Maria is intense. At first, she came off as someone who genuinely wanted to keep the neighborhood looking its best. She talked about property values and maintaining community standards, and at the time, it all seemed reasonable. After all, who wouldn't want to live in a well-kept neighborhood? But as time went on, her leadership became less about maintaining order and more about exerting absolute control. The shift wasn't immediate. It crept in gradually, small rule changes here, new fines there. Over time, more and more people started whispering about the sudden increase in notices for seemingly harmless infractions. Leaving your trash bin out a little too long? Fine. Planting the wrong type of flowers? Violation. Having patio furniture that wasn't explicitly approved? Citation. It didn't take long before homeowners were walking on eggshells, afraid of accidentally triggering Maria's never-ending list of restrictions. By the time I found myself tangled in a fight with her, the tension in the neighborhood had already reached its peak. And what started my battle with Maria? Something so trivial it was almost laughable. People using my driveway as a turnaround spot. Because my house sat on a bend near a busier road, drivers would constantly pull in, back out, and take off like my property was some public intersection. It wasn't just inconvenient. It was outright frustrating. The tire marks, the occasional oil stains, and the weird feeling of random cars pulling up near my living room window at all hours had been grating on me for months. There had even been times when I had to slam on my brakes to avoid colliding with someone who decided to whip into my driveway without warning. After putting up with it for far too long, I decided to put an end to it once and for all. My solution? A simple black sliding gate. Nothing too flashy, nothing over the top. Just a mid-height, functional gate designed to keep random cars from treating my driveway like a public turnaround. I didn't take this decision lightly either. Before even considering the installation, I spent several nights combing through the HOA's bylaws, searching for anything that might prevent me from putting up a gate. I also double-checked the city's building codes to ensure I wasn't violating any municipal regulations. Once I was confident that I was in the clear, I got the necessary permits, hired a reliable contractor, and set a date for installation. The work was done on a Saturday. The crew arrived early, hauling in the materials, metal panels, rolling tracks, an electronic keypad for access. They measured, leveled, and carefully set everything up to ensure the gate would function smoothly. By the afternoon, it was complete. I took a step back, admiring how well it blended with the rest of the property. No more surprise tire tracks, no more near accidents, no more strangers pulling up at all hours. And on top of that, it actually looked good, matching the dark metal accents on my front porch lights and garage handle. I even joked with one of the installers that the HOA would probably be impressed with how seamless it looked. Little did I know, that gate had just put a giant target on my back. The very next morning around 7:30 a.m., I stepped outside to water my recently planted rose bushes. As the water arched over the petals, glistening in the early sunlight, my eyes drifted toward the street. That's when I saw her, Maria. She was standing just across from my house, right by the sidewalk, holding up her phone and snapping pictures of my driveway. She wasn't trying to be discreet either. She adjusted her phone, shifting angles like some sort of real estate photographer, except I knew these pictures weren't for a listing. They were for something else. I paused for a moment, gripping the hose, watching her take shot after shot of my new gate. The quiet morning atmosphere, filled only with the sounds of sprinklers and birds, felt oddly disturbed by the constant clicking of her camera. After a long few seconds, I gave her a polite wave and called out, "Morning, Maria. Everything okay?" I wasn't expecting a warm response, but even I was caught off guard by what happened next. Instead of returning my greeting, she tucked her phone under her arm, shot me a look so sharp it could cut glass, and turned on her heel. Without saying a single word, she stomped away, her expensive sneakers clicking against the pavement with every irritated step. That was the first real moment I felt something was off. Normally, I wouldn't let someone like Maria get under my skin, but I had heard enough stories about her to know that when she set her sights on something, she didn't back down easily. Sure enough, the next morning, I found out just how fast she was willing to act. Sticking out of my mailbox, pinned in place by the red flag, was a bright yellow notice, stamped with the official HOA seal. My stomach twisted as I pulled it out, already having a bad feeling about what I was going to read. In bold letters, the notice declared, "HOA violation. Unauthorized modification." My eyes skimmed over the text, irritation building with every word. According to the notice, I had 48 hours to remove the unauthorized metal gate or face immediate fines, with further enforcement measures listed as a vague but ominous threat. Anger surged through me. I had done everything by the book, checked the HOA bylaws, confirmed city regulations, even pulled the necessary permits. My gate was completely within the guidelines. There was even a section in the HOA rules that explicitly stated automatic gates were allowed, provided they matched the surrounding fencing and did not exceed 6 feet in height. My gate checked every box. So, why was I suddenly being hit with a violation notice? After taking a few deep breaths, I decided I wasn't going to react emotionally. I was going to handle this the right way. If Maria had filed the complaint, then I was going to approach her directly, with all my paperwork in hand. Maybe I thought it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe she was relying on outdated rules, or had some concerns that I could clarify. I was determined to talk to her like two reasonable adults and resolve this before it got out of hand. My mother always believed that when dealing with conflict, it helps to bring a peace offering. Her go-to? Homemade cookies. She always said, people have a hard time staying angry when you offer them something sweet. I figured it was worth a shot. So, I spent the afternoon baking a fresh batch of chocolate chip cookies using her tried-and-true recipe. Real butter, semi-sweet chocolate, a dash of sea salt for contrast. They smelled amazing. I packed them in a clear container, tucked my paperwork under my arm, and headed toward Maria's house, fully prepared to have a rational conversation. She lived in a 2-story house at the end of the block, a place that practically looked like an advertisement for the ideal suburban home. The lawn was manicured to perfection, the hedges trimmed with absolute precision, and a perfectly centered welcome mat lay in front of her door. If appearances alone could earn someone the presidency of an HOA, Maria had it locked down. But what stood out even more than the carefully maintained aesthetic was the conspicuous security camera positioned above the front door, aimed directly at anyone who stepped onto the porch. As I approached, the lens on the camera suddenly shifted, the little motor humming as it adjusted to track my movement. Before I could even reach the doorbell, a crackling sound came through the speaker, followed by Maria's voice. Her tone was sharp and uninviting, already filled with hostility before I even had a chance to speak. She wasted no time getting straight to the point, declaring that she saw me and was documenting everything. The next thing she said made my stomach tighten. She claimed my gate was lowering property values and that she had already submitted her photos to the HOA board. Without even letting me respond, she announced that an emergency meeting was being held the next day to address the issue. I stood there for a moment, still holding the container of freshly baked cookies in one hand and my stack of paperwork in the other. An emergency meeting over a gate that followed every regulation? That seemed completely over the top. Taking a deep breath, I cleared my throat and tried to respond calmly. I let her know that I had all the necessary paperwork to prove that my gate was compliant, hoping she would at least be open to a conversation. She cut me off immediately, her voice flat and dismissive. She told me to leave, saying she was not interested in any excuses. Just like that, the conversation was over before it even started. Defeated, I turned and walked away, my attempts at a civil discussion completely ignored. The cookies, which were meant as a peace offering, remained undelivered, still warm in the container as I made my way back home. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that Maria wasn't just going to let this go. My mind kept running through different scenarios, trying to figure out why she was making such a big deal out of something so minor. Was she really convinced my gate was an issue, or was this about something else entirely? A personal grudge, a power play, a way to remind the neighborhood who was in charge? Determined to be absolutely certain I was in the right, I spent the next several hours going over the HOA bylaws, my permits, and every document related to my gate. By midnight, I had practically memorized every section. There was no doubt. I had followed every rule. But just because I was right didn't mean Maria was going to back down. The real warning sign came later that night. It was around 10 p.m. when my phone buzzed with an alert from my security camera. Expecting to see nothing more than a stray cat or a passing car, I casually opened the app, only to feel my stomach drop. The feed showed Maria and two other HOA board members standing in my driveway, flashlights in hand. They were whispering to each other, measuring the dimensions of my driveway and writing things down on clipboards. But what really caught my attention was the small, sleek business card in one of the board members' hands. The camera footage was a little grainy in the dark, but I could still make out the words printed on it: Elite HOA Enforcement Solutions. Something about the name felt off, so I quickly pulled out my phone and typed it into a search engine. Nothing legitimate came up. No official website, no company records, nothing except a few vague mentions in online forums discussing scam security outfits. The more I searched, the more alarm bells started ringing. A reverse lookup of the phone number on the card revealed that it was linked to a man with a history of arrests for impersonating a security officer. That was the moment I realized that whatever was happening, it had gone far beyond a simple HOA dispute. Sure enough, the next morning I received a text from Maria. The message was short but packed with arrogance. Emergency HOA meeting, 9 a.m. sharp, attendance mandatory, and the kicker, bring your checkbook, fine start at $500 per day. My grip tightened around my phone as I read those words. A $500 daily fine over a gate that was completely legal? The sheer audacity was unbelievable. When I arrived at the neighborhood small clubhouse 15 minutes before the meeting, I found that several of my neighbors had already gathered. Some looked anxious, others curious, probably wondering why Maria had suddenly called for an emergency meeting. Most of them had never even attended one before, let alone been summoned to one on such short notice. As I stepped inside, I immediately noticed that Maria had turned the room into a full-blown presentation space. A projector stood at the front, connected to a laptop, while rows of chairs were neatly arranged facing the makeshift stage. Maria, standing confidently in her usual polished outfit, had her arms crossed as if she were about to unveil the grandest revelation of the century. The two board members who had been snooping around my property the night before stood beside her, setting up what looked like a PowerPoint slideshow. At exactly 9 a.m., Maria cleared her throat dramatically and tapped her laptop, bringing the projector to life. The first slide appeared on the screen in bold letters: "The decline of our community standards." My stomach twisted as I took in the exaggerated images that filled the screen. The photos, which looked like they had been pulled from the worst corners of the internet, displayed rundown houses, peeling paint, and trash-covered yards. Not a single one of these images was actually from our neighborhood, but Maria acted as if they were. For the next 10 minutes, she rambled on about how the neighborhood was at risk. She warned that if people were allowed to make unchecked modifications to their properties, it would lead to chaos. She used vague fear-mongering language, implying that one non-conforming structure would open the floodgates for all kinds of unwanted changes. Then, she clicked to the next slide, a side-by-side comparison of what appeared to be normal driveways on one side and, on the other, a heavily manipulated image of my driveway with the gate. In the Photoshopped version, my gate looked absurd, taller, bulkier, and somehow more ominous than reality. A few gasps came from the audience, clearly reacting to the doctored images. I stood up, forcing myself to stay composed. I pointed directly at the screen and spoke firmly, saying that the image was not an accurate representation of my gate. I had the paperwork to prove it was compliant, and I was willing to show anyone who wanted to see it. Maria, unfazed, clicked her remote again. A new slide appeared: financial ramifications. A ridiculous bar graph, completely unlabeled with no sources, attempted to show how property values would supposedly plummet if my gate was allowed to stay. The numbers were random percentages with no context, but it was clear that Maria was trying to stir up panic among the homeowners. Then came her final declaration. She announced that the HOA board had unanimously voted to fine me $1,500 per day until the gate was removed. And to make matters worse, she revealed that they had contracted a security firm, West Valley Security Services, to ensure compliance. If I refused to remove the gate, they would escalate. I took a deep breath, suppressing my anger. I wasn't about to be intimidated. I stood up once again and addressed the entire room, raising my voice just enough so that everyone could hear me. I had every necessary permit. The HOA bylaws, specifically Section 7.3, explicitly allowed automatic gates of this type. Mine was within regulation, standing no taller than 6 feet, made of black metal, and in line with the design of the surrounding fences. More importantly, I had never been given prior notice that the gate was not allowed. The violation notice had only appeared after the installation was completed. To back up my point, I pulled out my paperwork and started handing out copies. Some neighbors took them, flipping through the pages, nodding in agreement as they realized I had done everything by the book. Maria slammed her palm on the podium, cutting me off. "The board has decided," she said coldly. "There will be no further discussion. West Valley Security Services has been informed. If the gate is not removed by the end of the week, they will handle enforcement." Her words sent a chill through the room. What did she mean by handle enforcement? Typically, an HOA could issue fines, send notices, or in extreme cases, place a lien on a property. But bringing in a security firm? That was unheard of. I refused to back down. I wasn't going to be bullied. I stated firmly that I would not remove a gate that was legally allowed. If they wanted to fine me, that was their choice, but I would not be paying a single cent for a violation that didn't actually exist. Maria's expression hardened. "Then prepare for the consequences," she hissed. The meeting was over, but I had a feeling that this battle was just beginning. After the meeting, I approached one of the more reasonable board members. He stood near the entrance, clutching the paperwork I had handed out during the meeting. His expression was conflicted, like someone who had just realized they were part of something they didn't fully agree with. Lowering my voice, I asked him directly if he really believed this so-called security firm was legitimate. He hesitated before responding, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. He admitted that Maria had insisted on hiring them, claiming that she had worked with them before in another community. But then he dropped a key piece of information. There had never been an official vote. The board hadn't formally approved the hiring of West Valley Security Services. Maria had unilaterally decided to bring them in, stating that the situation required immediate action. That was all I needed to hear. I pressed further, asking if the board had been given any documentation proving that this firm was legitimate. He swallowed hard and shook his head. Maria had handled everything. There had been no review process, No verification of credentials, nothing. The more I heard, the more convinced I became that something was seriously wrong. I thanked him for his honesty and left, my mind racing. In an ideal world, I would have been able to rally the entire neighborhood on the spot, showing them the truth and turning the tide against Maria. But HOAs were tricky. Some people were afraid to push back, worried that they would become the next target. Others simply didn't care, preferring to stay out of conflicts altogether. I briefly considered contacting a lawyer, but I held off, at least for now. My father was the chief of police, but I hadn't told him about any of this yet. I wanted to handle it on my own, believing that logic and facts would ultimately win out. I still had faith in the system, thinking that once Maria realized she had no legal basis for her actions, she would be forced to back down. I could not have been more wrong. The next morning, at exactly 7 a.m., my phone started buzzing with alerts from my security camera system. Groggy from sleep, I reached for my phone, expecting to see a notification about a stray animal or a passing jogger. Instead, what I saw made my stomach drop. 3 black SUVs were parked directly in front of my house. Each one had the words HOA enforcement plastered in large white letters across the side. At least 6 individuals were outside, dressed in matching black uniforms, cargo pants, and boots. Security was printed in bold letters across their shirts, each of them wearing a cheap-looking badge. One of them even had a large German Shepherd on a leash, the dog barking aggressively as if ready to charge. And right in the middle of them, standing with her phone raised and recording everything, was Maria. I sat up instantly, my heart pounding. I swiped through my security camera feeds, trying to process what was happening. One of the uniformed men pounded on my front door with his fist, his voice booming through the intercom. He demanded that I open up immediately, stating that this was my final warning. If I refused to remove the gate, they would take action themselves. I clenched my jaw, adrenaline flooding my system. Forced to take action? Over a gate? I switched to another camera angle, zooming in on their vehicles. The more I examined them, the more I noticed red flags. There were no official license plates, just paper placeholders taped to the back windows. Their badges looked fake, too polished and plastic-like. The entire setup screamed amateur. Then it clicked. These were the same people connected to that shady business card I had seen in my driveway the other night. They weren't a real security firm. They were a group of frauds playing dress-up, hoping to intimidate me into submission. I activated my intercom and spoke through the camera's microphone. My voice was steady but firm. I asked them who they were and demanded to see legal documentation proving they had any authority to be on my property. Maria cut in before any of them could answer. Her voice dripped with condescension as she told me I had ignored multiple warnings and that this was the final step. If I didn't remove my so-called eyesore of a gate immediately, these men would do it for me. One of the men walked toward the SUV and pulled out what looked like a massive pair of bolt cutters. Another patted the dog, muttering something under his breath. That was it. I wasn't about to let this go any further. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my contacts, my fingers moving on instinct. When my father answered, his voice was calm, but I could tell he instantly knew something was wrong. I kept my explanation short, telling him that an unverified security group had just shown up at my house, armed with bolt cutters and AK-9 unit, demanding that I remove my gate. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before his voice shifted into full police mode. Stay inside. Lock your doors. Do not engage them. Backup is on the way. I hung up and turned my attention back to the security camera feeds. Outside, the men were getting impatient. One of them banged on my door again, the German Shepherd pulling hard at its leash. I took a deep breath and spoke through the microphone one last time. This is private property. You are trespassing. I have called the police. If you do not leave immediately, you will be facing real legal consequences. A flicker of uncertainty crossed one of the men's faces, but Maria wasn't backing down. She crossed her arms and smirked, calling out that no one was above the rules. Not even me. I steadied my breathing, because the real law was about to arrive. Just as one of the men stepped forward with a power tool, where he got it so quickly, I had no idea I heard it. The distant wail of approaching sirens. My heart pounded as blue and red lights flickered at the far end of the street. Within moments, a marked police cruiser pulled up behind the SUVs, blocking them in. The so-called security officers immediately froze, exchanging uneasy glances. Maria, however, was still standing tall, her phone raised high as she continued to record, her smirk unwavering. It was as if she still believed she had the upper hand, as if she thought she was completely in the right. The driver's side door of the cruiser opened, and out stepped my father, Chief Gary Williams. His presence alone shifted the entire atmosphere. Dressed in his full uniform, he walked toward the group with a practiced authority, his expression unreadable. He had been in law enforcement for years, and this wasn't the first time he had dealt with people pretending to have power they didn't actually possess. His voice carried across the yard, calm yet firm. He introduced himself, his badge gleaming under the morning light, and with a single, unwavering command, he told them all to stand down immediately. Maria visibly stiffened, her phone dipping slightly as she processed what was happening. One of the so-called security officers took a cautious step back, likely realizing that the situation had turned against them in an instant. My father scanned the scene, his sharp gaze lingering on the bolt cutters, the fake security badges, and the aggressive German shepherd that was still pulling at its handler's leash. Then, without breaking stride, he stopped in front of the man holding the power tool. "Put that down," my father instructed coolly, "and show me your credentials, if you have any." The man hesitated, his grip tightening around the tool for a moment before slowly lowering it. "We were contracted by the HOA," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. My father didn't blink. "Your license," he repeated. "Your bond papers. Your private security registration. Anything official." The silence that followed was deafening. One by one, the so-called security officers either shrugged or fumbled through their pockets, attempting to pull out random scraps of paper that looked anything but official. Two of them had cheap plastic badges that bore no real insignia, and the dog handler had no identification at all. The entire operation was unraveling before their eyes. "That's enough," my father finally said, his tone shifting. "You're all under investigation for impersonating licensed security personnel. Do not make any sudden moves." Behind him, two uniformed officers stepped forward, Paul and Kenneth, each taking a pair of handcuffs from their belts. Maria, now visibly nervous, took a small step backward, her smug expression faltering. But just as she turned, trying to slip away quietly, Officer Kenneth called out to her, "Ma'am, please stay where you are." Her head snapped up, panic flickering in her eyes for the first time. She squared her shoulders, her voice rising. "But I'm the HOA president. They're in violation. We were just enforcing the rules." My father looked at her, unimpressed. "HOA rules don't override state or county law," he stated. "You cannot hire unlicensed security to carry out a forced removal. This is far beyond your authority." Maria opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. Her face had gone pale, her confidence evaporating as the reality of the situation sank in. Inside my house, I finally exhaled, relief flooding through me. Even though I had been standing my ground, there was no denying that having a group of uniformed strangers pounding on my door had been terrifying. But now, watching as the real law stepped in, the balance of power had shifted entirely. By the time it was all over, the situation had unfolded at lightning speed. The fake security officers were handcuffed and placed in the back of the squad cars, facing a range of charges from trespassing to impersonating security personnel. The German shepherd, clearly just following orders, was taken into custody by animal control, ensuring its safety until its rightful owner could be identified. Maria stood stiffly off to the side, arms crossed, her entire body tense as she watched the scene unfold. Then, Officer Kenneth approached her once again. "We need you to come down to the station for questioning regarding the hiring of these individuals," he said firmly. "There's reason to believe HOA funds may have been misused." Maria's mask cracked. "I only did what was necessary to maintain community standards. We had a board vote," she stammered. "We have a right to enforce the rules." My father gestured toward the unmarked SUVs with the fake HOA enforcement stickers. "You do not have the right to authorize what amounts to a private militia on someone's property without legal grounds." And by the way, these vehicles aren't even properly registered. Maria turned to me then, her expression a mixture of fury and desperation. I hope you're happy now, she spat. This is your fault. Refusing to follow the rules and undermining community values. I shook my head in disbelief. Even now, as she stood on the verge of total legal ruin, she was still trying to spin the narrative to make me the villain. But it didn't matter anymore. Her reign was over. Later that same day, news of the raid spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Phones rang nonstop, texts flooded in, and local message boards lit up with discussions about what had just unfolded. By evening, nearly everyone in the community had heard the story. Maria had hired a group of fake security officers to forcibly remove a legally compliant gate, and she had been caught red-handed when the police arrived. People speculated about how she had funded it, whether she had misused HOA money, and how many rules she had broken in the process. The remaining HOA board members scrambled to contain the damage, calling an emergency meeting of their own. But this time, it was a real emergency. When I arrived at the meeting, the energy in the room was completely different from before. There were no smug presentations, no scare tactics, no doctored images. Instead, there was frustration, anger, and a growing demand for accountability. Neighbors who had previously remained silent were now speaking up, sharing their own grievances. One couple revealed that Maria had threatened them with fines for something as absurd as having a recycling bin visible for too long. Another elderly homeowner admitted that she had been forced to repaint her house after Maria claimed the color wasn't in line with the HOA's vision. Story after story came out, each one painting a picture of a leader who had been abusing her power long before she set her sights on me. The turning point came when someone demanded to see the financial records, questioning whether Maria had illegally funneled HOA funds into hiring the so-called security team. The room fell into hushed whispers as the board members exchanged nervous glances. Then, without hesitation, one member called for an immediate vote to remove Maria as president. The decision was unanimous. Just like that, Maria was stripped of her authority, her reign over the neighborhood collapsing in a matter of minutes. But it wasn't just her title she lost. Soon after, a full-scale audit of the HOA's finances was announced, with board members vowing to investigate exactly how much money had been misused. The legal consequences of her actions weren't far behind either. With the police already involved, she was facing real scrutiny, and word quickly spread that she might even have to pay back every penny she had taken from the HOA's budget. Within days, Maria went from being the most feared figure in the community to a complete outcast. The same people who once whispered about her now openly condemned her. It wasn't long before a for sale sign appeared in front of her picture-perfect house, signaling that she was leaving the neighborhood for good. A few months later, she was gone. No farewell messages, no final power plays. Just an empty house and the lingering memory of what had once been her iron-fisted rule. And my gate? It stayed. No more violation notices, no more threats, and certainly no more fake security teams showing up at my doorstep with bolt cutters and a K-9 unit. In the days that followed Maria's removal, the entire neighborhood seemed to breathe easier. People who had once been too afraid to challenge her started making small changes to their homes. New flower beds, decorative lighting, even a few backyard renovations that had previously been deemed unauthorized by Maria's ever-changing standards. The HOA, now under new leadership, quickly backtracked on the absurd fine she had issued, refunding the homeowners who had been unfairly charged. As for me, I went about my life as usual, but with a newfound appreciation for standing my ground. If there was one thing this whole ordeal had taught me, it was that some people, when given power, will do anything to keep it, even if it means stepping far outside the bounds of legality. Maria had underestimated me. She had assumed that I would cave under pressure, that I would simply accept her authority without question. What she didn't count on was the fact that I had done my homework, that I had the law on my side, and more importantly, that I wasn't someone who could be intimidated into submission. Looking back, it still amazed me how far she had been willing to go over something as simple as a gate. But in the end, her downfall wasn't about a gate at all. It was about her own arrogance, her obsession with control, and her inability to see the line between power and abuse. It wasn't long before her house was bought by a new family, a couple with two young kids who had no idea about the drama that had unfolded there. Life moved on, the neighborhood settled back into normalcy, and for the first time in years, it actually felt like a community again. And my gate? It became more than just a barrier to keep cars from using my driveway. It became a symbol of standing up for what's right, of not letting someone bully you just because they hold a title. The best part? Every time I pulled into my driveway, I got to see that gate still standing, right where it belonged.